They thought destroying his bike would break his spirit, but what happened next left an entire school stunned and changed everything they believed about strength, courage, and what it really means to stand up for yourself. The autumn leaves crunched. Under worn sneakers as 12-year-old Marcus, Schwinn wheeled his bicycle through the gates of Riverside Middle School for the first time. The morning air carried the scent of fresh pencil shavings and the nervous energy that always accompanies new beginnings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had moved to this small Oregon town just 3 days ago, leaving behind everything familiar in Sacramento when his mother accepted a nursing position at the local hospital. The transition hadn't been easy, and today marked his first real test at fitting into a place where everyone seemed to already know their place in the intricate social hierarchy that governs middle school life. The bike beneath his hands wasn't much to look at, but it meant everything to him. It was a vintage Schwinn Stingray from the 1970s, painted a deep forest green with chrome fenders that caught the morning light despite their age. Most kids his age rode modern mountain bikes or sleek BMX models with flashy graphics and multiple gears, but Marcus's bike told a different story. His grandfather had given it to him 3 years ago, right before cancer took him away. The old man had spent months in his garage, carefully restoring every component, replacing worn parts, and teaching Marcus about the patience required to bring something broken back to life. Marcus remembered those afternoons vividly. His grandfather's weathered hands guiding his smaller ones as they adjusted the chain tension, the smell of WD-40 and old motor oil filling the cramped workspace. The lessons weren't just about bicycles. They were about perseverance, about finding value in things others might discard, about understanding that true worth isn't always visible on the surface. The bike had become more than transportation. It was a connection to someone who had believed in him unconditionally, a tangible reminder that he carried his grandfather's wisdom wherever he went. Now standing in the bike rack area of his new school, Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes studying him. Conversations quieted as students noticed the newcomer with the unusual ride. He could hear fragments of whispered comments drifting on the morning breeze, not all of them kind. The bike rack itself was a testament to the economic diversity of the student body. Expensive carbon fiber racing bikes stood next to department store models. Electric scooters shared space with traditional 10 speeds, and everything in between created a metallic rainbow of adolescent transportation choices. Marcus carefully locked his bike with the heavy chain his mother had insisted he carry, double-checking the mechanism even, though he knew it was secure. The ritual gave him a moment to compose himself, to push down the familiar knot of anxiety that had been his constant companion since the move. He had always been good at blending into the background, at observing rather than participating, but something about this new environment felt different. The air itself seemed charged with unspoken challenges and established territories that he didn't yet understand. The first bell rang across the campus, its shrill tone cutting through the morning chatter and sending students streaming toward the main building. Marcus shouldered his backpack, took one last look at his grandfather's bike, and joined the flow of bodies moving toward their first period classes. The hallways of Riverside Middle School were typical of their kind, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue, lockers painted in the school colors of blue and gold, and bulletin boards covered with announcements for upcoming events and academic achievements. Marcus had studied his schedule the night before, memorizing room numbers and trying to plot the most efficient routes between classes. His first period was English with Mrs. Patterson, located in the newer wing of the building where the carpet was less worn and the whiteboards hadn't yet accumulated the ghostly stains of thousands of erased lessons. He found the room easily enough and slipped into a seat near the back, hoping to observe the social dynamics before making any moves that might mark him as different or vulnerable. Mrs. Patterson, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of patient demeanor that suggested years of dealing with adolescent drama. She welcomed Marcus to the class with genuine warmth, introducing him to his classmates without making a big production of it. The other students offered polite smiles and small waves, the sort of surface-level friendliness that felt safe and non-committal. Marcus began to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps this transition would be smoother than he had feared. It was during the break between first and second period that he first encountered the group that would come to define his early weeks at Riverside Middle School. They called themselves the Kings, though no one seemed to remember exactly when or how the name had originated. What mattered was that everyone knew who they were and what they represented in the complex ecosystem of middle school social hierarchies. They were the boys who walked through hallways with the confidence of ownership, who commanded attention without asking for it, who seemed to exist in a bubble of perpetual coolness that lesser mortals could only dream of penetrating. The unofficial leader of this group was a 13-year-old named Tyler Harrison. Tyler was tall for his age, with the kind of athletic build that came from years of organized sports and good genetics. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes carried the subtle logos of expensive brands, and his smile had the practiced charm of someone who had learned early that charisma could open doors and smooth over inconvenient obstacles. Tyler's father owned the largest construction company in town, a fact that seemed to grant the family a sort of aristocratic status in their small community. Flanking Tyler were his closest lieutenants, Jake Morrison, whose red hair and freckled face might have made him a target for bullying in a different context, but whose fierce loyalty to Tyler and willingness to escalate any conflict had earned him respect and fear in equal measure. And Devin Walsh, a stocky boy with dark hair and an unsettling ability to find exactly the right words to make someone feel small and insignificant. Together, they formed a triumvirate of adolescent power that had gone largely unchallenged for the better part of 2 years. Their first interaction with Marcus was subtle, almost casual. They were standing near his locker as he approached to retrieve his science textbook, their conversation loud enough to be clearly heard, but not so obvious as to seem deliberately confrontational. Tyler was describing his new mountain bike, a top-of-the-line model that his father had bought him for maintaining a B average through the previous semester. The bike cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month, and Tyler made sure everyone within earshot understood this fact. I mean, carbon fiber frame, electronic shifting, full suspension, Tyler was saying, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to having the best of everything. My dad says if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right. No point in riding some piece of junk that's going to fall apart when you actually need it to perform. Jake laughed on cue, adding his own commentary about the superiority of modern bicycles over older models. Yeah, I saw some weird vintage thing in the bike rack this morning. Looked like something from a museum. Can't believe anyone would actually ride that thing to school. Devin, ever the wordsmith when it came to casual cruelty, delivered the final observation with surgical precision. Probably belongs to that new kid. Marcus, right? Makes sense he'd have something old and weird. Bet. It doesn't even have real brakes. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he worked the combination on his locker, trying to appear as though he hadn't heard the conversation that was clearly intended for his benefit. His grandfather's bike didn't have the flashy components or modern conveniences of contemporary models, but it was solid, reliable, and carried more meaning than any store-bought machine ever could. The casual dismissal of something so precious to him felt like a slap, but he knew better than to rise to the bait on his first day. The morning continued without further incident, but Marcus found himself hyper-aware of the King's presence throughout his classes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They seemed to materialize in his peripheral vision at regular intervals, always talking loudly about topics that seemed designed to highlight the differences between their world and his. During lunch, he sat alone at a table near the windows, eating the sandwich his mother had packed while watching other students navigate the complex social negotiations that determined who sat where and with whom. The cafeteria was its own universe, with territories as clearly defined as any medieval kingdom. The athletes claimed the center tables, their letterman jackets and easy confidence marking them as the school's royalty. The academic achievers clustered near the far wall, their conversations a mixture of homework anxiety and college preparation strategies. The artistic students had carved out a corner near the stage, their table decorated with sketchbooks and band equipment. And scattered throughout were the various smaller tribes and individuals who didn't fit neatly into any category, but had found their own ways to survive and sometimes thrive in the ecosystem. Marcus observed it all with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a new culture. He had always been something of an outsider, even in his previous school where he had known everyone since elementary school. There was something about his quiet intensity, his preference for books over sports, his habit of thinking before speaking, that set him apart from his peers. It wasn't that he was unpopular exactly, but he had never been part of the inner circles that seemed to form naturally around certain personalities. His afternoon classes passed in a blur of introductions and syllabus reviews, the standard first day. Rituals that teachers everywhere seemed to follow. Marcus dutifully copied down assignment schedules and classroom rules, participated when called upon, and began to form preliminary impressions of his new academic environment. The work seemed manageable, the teachers appeared competent and fair, and several of his classmates had made small gestures of welcome that suggested friendship might be possible given time and opportunity. It was during his final period, physical education with Coach Rodriguez, that the social dynamics of his new school became most apparent. The gymnasium was a cavernous space that smelled of rubber floors and adolescent anxiety, its walls lined with championship banners from decades of successful sports teams. Coach Rodriguez was a compact man with graying hair and the sort of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested a military background. He divided the class into teams for a game of basketball, using a system that seemed designed to quickly assess each student's athletic ability and social standing. Marcus had never been particularly gifted at sports, but he understood the fundamentals and could hold his own in casual games. What he lacked in natural ability, he made up for with effort and court awareness, the sort of hustle that coaches appreciated even if it didn't always translate to spectacular results. He found himself on a team with several other students who appeared to be somewhere in the middle of the athletic hierarchy, neither stars nor complete disasters. Tyler, predictably, was chosen as a team captain and surrounded himself with the school's better athletes. His team moved with the sort of practiced coordination that suggested they had played together many times before, their passes crisp and their communication seamless. They won the scrimmage easily, celebrating each basket with the sort of enthusiastic display that seemed designed as much for the audience as for their own satisfaction. After the game, as students changed back into their regular clothes, Marcus overheard Tyler and his friends discussing plans for after school. They were going to ride their bikes to the new skate park that had recently opened on the other side of town, a facility that had been the subject of much excitement and dissipation throughout the community. The conversation was loud and inclusive, in the way that teenagers used to signal their social status, making sure that everyone within earshot understood they were part of something exclusive and desirable. "You should see my bike on those hills," Tyler was saying as he pulled his expensive polo shirt over his head. "Thing climbs like it's got a motor. We'll probably hit some of the trails behind the park too. Really test what these machines can do." Jake added his own commentary about the technical features of his bicycle, throwing around terms like gear ratios and suspension travel with the confidence of someone who had memorized marketing materials without necessarily understanding the underlying concepts. Devin, meanwhile, was scanning the locker room with the sort of predatory awareness that suggested he was looking for opportunities to establish dominance or create entertainment at someone else's expense. Marcus finished changing quickly and quietly, hoping to avoid drawing attention to himself. He had learned in his previous school that the end of the day often brought out the worst in certain types of students, as though the approaching freedom of afternoon and evening made them more willing to take risks or push boundaries. He gathered his books, checked that he had everything he needed for homework, and prepared to make his exit as unobtrusively as possible. The final bell rang with its familiar tone of liberation, and students began their exodus from the building with the sort of enthusiasm that only the end of a school day can inspire. Marcus joined the flow of bodies moving toward the exits, his thoughts already turning to the quiet afternoon he had planned. His mother wouldn't be home from her shift at the hospital until after 6, giving him several hours to explore his new neighborhood, perhaps find a library or bookstore where he could settle into this sort of routine that helped him feel grounded in unfamiliar places. He reached the bike rack area just as the afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the concrete. The space was busy with students unlocking their rides and making plans for the remainder of the day. Marcus approached his grandfather's bike with the same careful attention he always gave it, checking the lock and mentally reviewing his planned route home. The streets of this new town were still unfamiliar to him, and he wanted to take his time learning the safest and most efficient paths between important locations. As he worked the combination on his lock, he became aware of voices approaching from behind. The tone was casual, conversational, but there was something in the rhythm of this speech that made his shoulders tense slightly. He didn't turn around, continuing to focus on his lock while using his peripheral vision to monitor the situation developing around him. Tyler, Jake, and Devin had materialized near the bike rack, their own expensive machines already unlocked and ready for departure. They were ostensibly preparing to leave for their planned excursion to the skate park, but their movements seemed deliberately slow, as though they were waiting for something or someone. Marcus continued working on his lock, hoping that whatever was about to happen would pass over him without incident. "Hey Marcus, right?" Tyler's voice was friendly, almost warm, but there was something underneath it that made Marcus's instincts prickle with warning. "How was your first day? Everyone treating you okay?" Marcus turned to face the older boy, keeping his expression neutral and his voice steady. "Yeah, it was fine. Thanks for asking." Tyler smiled, the sort of practiced expression that politicians and salespeople perfect over years of use. "Cool, cool. That's great to hear. This is actually a pretty good school once you get to know everyone and figure out how things work around here." Jake and Devin had positioned themselves on either side of Tyler, their body language casual but somehow predatory. Marcus found himself thinking of nature documentaries he had watched, the way pack hunters would surround their prey while maintaining the pretense of innocent curiosity. The comparison made him more alert, more aware of potential exit routes and defensive positions. "That's an interesting bike you've got there," Tyler continued, his gaze shifting to the vintage Schwinn with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Don't think I've ever seen one quite like it. Is it some kind of antique or something?" The question felt loaded, though Marcus couldn't quite identify the specific threat it contained. He chose his words carefully, trying to provide enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing more than necessary about his personal history or emotional attachments. "It's a 1970 Schwinn Stingray," he said simply. "My grandfather restored it." Devin stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the bike more closely. 1970s? Dude, that thing is older than our parents. Does it even work properly? I mean, those old bikes didn't have any of the safety features or performance technology that modern ones do. Marcus felt a familiar defensive surge rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. These boys didn't know anything about his grandfather, about the love and skill that had gone into bringing this particular machine back to life, about the countless hours of careful work and the patient teaching that had accompanied every adjustment and improvement. To them, it was just an old bike, probably worth less than the accessories on their modern machines. "It works fine," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "Everything on it has been rebuilt or replaced. It's probably more reliable than most new bikes." Tyler's smile widened, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm sure it is. Your grandfather sounds like he knew what he was doing. It's just, around here most people ride more contemporary stuff. Might be hard to keep up with the group rides and everything. Some of the trails we hit are pretty technical." The implication was clear, though delivered with enough subtle politeness to maintain plausible deniability. Marcus was being informed that his bike, and by extension he himself, didn't meet the standards of the local cycling community. It was a form of social gatekeeping that he had encountered before in different contexts. The way certain groups used equipment or clothing or cultural knowledge to establish boundaries between insiders and outsiders. Jake decided to be more direct in his assessment. "I mean, no offense, but that thing looks like it belongs in a museum. When's the last time it was actually ridden? The tires look pretty worn, and I can't even tell what kind of brakes it has." Marcus glanced down at his bike, seeing it suddenly through their eyes rather than his own. The paint, while carefully maintained, did show its age in places where the original factory finish had worn thin. The chrome fenders, though polished to a shine, bore the sort of minor imperfections that spoke of decades of use. The components, while functionally perfect, lacked the flashy aesthetics of contemporary bicycle technology. To someone who judged worth by newness and cost, it might indeed appear inadequate. But Marcus also saw what they couldn't: the precision of his grandfather's work, the way every part had been selected not for appearance, but for reliability and performance. The brake cables were routed with mathematical precision, the chain maintained at exactly the proper tension, the wheels true to tolerances that most shop mechanics would consider obsessive. It was a machine built by someone who understood that true quality came from attention to detail rather than marketing budgets. "The brakes are coaster brakes," Marcus explained, referring to the internal mechanism that engaged when the rider pedaled backward. "They're actually more reliable than rim brakes in wet conditions, and there's less maintenance required since there are fewer exposed components." Devin laughed, a sound that carried more mockery than amusement. "Coaster brakes? What is this, 1950? Dude, even little kids have handbrakes these days. How do you stop quickly in an emergency? What if you need to brake and pedal at the same time?" The technical criticism stung because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how coaster brake systems worked. But Marcus knew that explaining the intricacies of bicycle mechanics to a hostile audience would only make him appear more defensive and out of touch. Instead, he focused on getting his lock opened and preparing to leave before the conversation could escalate further. Tyler seemed to sense that his prey was preparing to escape, and his tone shifted slightly to become more urgent, more demanding of attention. "You know what, Marcus? I think you should come with us to the skate park today. It would be a great way for you to meet some people, get familiar with the local riding scene. What do you say?" The invitation felt like a trap, though Marcus couldn't immediately identify what sort of trap it might be. Everything about the situation suggested that accepting would be a mistake, but declining might be seen as antisocial or fearful. He found himself caught between conflicting instincts, wanting to make friends and fit in while also trusting his gut feeling that these particular boys did not have his best interests at heart. "Thanks, but I can't today," Marcus replied, finally getting his lock open and beginning to extract his bike from the rack. "I promised my mom I'd be home to help with some unpacking." Jake exchanged a look with Tyler that suggested this response had been anticipated. Come on, man, unpacking can wait. This is more important. You need to establish yourself in the social hierarchy here, and riding with us would definitely boost your status. Kids who ride alone tend to stay alone, if you know what I mean. The statement contained both an offer and a threat, wrapped in the sort of casual language that teenagers use to navigate complex social negotiations. Marcus understood that. He was being given a choice between acceptance and isolation, between conformity and independence. The problem was that he suspected the offered acceptance would come with conditions and expectations that he might not be willing to meet. Devin stepped closer to Marcus's bike, his hand reaching out to touch the vintage chrome handlebars. Seriously, though, I'm curious about how this thing rides. Mind if I try it out? Just around the parking lot? The request triggered every protective instinct Marcus possessed. The bike represented not just transportation, but connection to his grandfather, embodiment of countless shared memories, physical manifestation of love and craftsmanship that could never be replaced. The thought of letting someone who clearly didn't understand or respect its value take it for a casual test ride felt almost like betrayal of his grandfather's memory. I'd rather not, Marcus said firmly, positioning himself between Devin and the bike. It's adjusted specifically for my height and riding style. Thanks for understanding. Tyler's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the friendly mask slipping, for just a moment to reveal something colder underneath. The rejection of his friend's request had apparently crossed some sort of line, violated an unspoken rule about how new students were expected to defer to established social hierarchies. The temperature of the conversation seemed to drop several degrees, though the words remained superficially polite. That's too bad, Tyler said, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that sounded genuine even though Marcus suspected it was entirely performative. I was hoping we could all be friends. This school can be pretty tough for people who don't fit in, especially new kids who don't understand how things work around here. The implicit threat was becoming more explicit, though still wrapped in language that provided plausible deniability if any adults happened to overhear. Marcus recognized the pattern from his previous school, where similar groups had used comparable tactics to establish dominance and extract compliance from their peers. The key was to make the consequences of non-cooperation seem inevitable while maintaining the fiction that everything was friendly and voluntary. Jake decided to be more direct in his approach. Look, Marcus, we're trying to help you out here. Your first day went pretty well, but that's just because everyone was being polite. Things can change pretty quickly if people decide you're not worth the effort. Having the right friends makes all the difference. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as the conversation moved from subtle manipulation to open intimidation. These boys were essentially offering him protection from themselves, creating a problem so they could sell him the solution. It was a classic extortion scheme dressed up in the language of friendship and social guidance. I appreciate the advice, Marcus said carefully, beginning to walk his bike toward the parking lot exit. But I think I'll figure things out on my own. Thanks anyway. Devin moved to block his path, not aggressively, but clearly intentionally. Whoa, hold up there, Marcus. We're not done talking yet. It would be pretty rude to just walk away in the middle of a conversation, don't you think? The physical blocking escalated the situation beyond mere verbal intimidation. Marcus found himself calculating distances and angles, trying to determine how to get around Devin without triggering a more direct confrontation. The parking lot was still busy with students leaving for the day, but most were focused on their own conversations and preparations. He couldn't count on adult intervention or peer support if things went badly. Tyler stepped forward, his hand landing on Marcus's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a friendly gesture to any casual observer. Hey, no one's trying to give you a hard time here. We just want to make sure you understand the situation. This is a small school in a small town, and reputation matters. You can either be part of the group that people respect, or you can be the weird kid with the weird bike who doesn't have any friends. The hand on his shoulder felt heavy, possessive, like a claim of ownership that Marcus had never agreed to. He carefully stepped back, dislodging Tyler's grip while trying not to make the movement seem too aggressive or confrontational. Every instinct told him that showing fear would only make things worse, but standing up too forcefully might provoke exactly the kind of physical confrontation he was hoping to avoid. "I understand what you're saying," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "But I'm not looking to join any groups right now. I just want to get home and help my mom with the move." Jake laughed, but the sound contained no humor. "Your mom? Seriously? You're going to blow off the chance to make friends because your mommy needs help unpacking boxes? That's exactly the kind of thing that's going to make people think you're a baby." The attack on his relationship with his mother crossed another line, moving from general intimidation to personal insult. Marcus felt anger surge through him, hot and immediate, but he forced himself to maintain control. These boys were clearly trying to provoke him into doing something stupid, something that would give them justification for whatever they had planned. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "My family is important to me," Marcus said simply. "I'm sorry if that's hard for you to understand." Tyler's expression hardened completely, the last vestige of friendliness disappearing like a mask. Being removed. "You know what, Marcus? I think you're making a big mistake here. A really big mistake. This town isn't as friendly as it seems on the surface, especially for people who think they're too good to be part of the community." Devin nodded agreement, his hand still resting on Marcus's bicycle handlebars in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. "Yeah, things have a way of going wrong for people who don't fit in. Accidents happen. Equipment breaks. Sometimes people just find themselves all alone when they really need help." The threats were becoming increasingly unsubtle, though still wrapped in enough ambiguity to provide legal cover if anyone official ever investigated. Marcus understood that he was being given a final opportunity to submit to their authority, to accept whatever position in their hierarchy they deemed appropriate for him. The alternative, clearly, would be some form of ongoing harassment designed to make his life at this school as miserable as possible. Part of him, the part that had learned to survive by adapting and compromising, whispered that maybe it would be easier to just go along with what they wanted. How bad could it really be to ride to the skate park with them, to laugh at their jokes, and accept their conditional friendship? Surely it would be better than spending the next 2 years as a social outcast, constantly looking over his shoulder for the next humiliation or attack. But another part of him, the part that carried his grandfather's lessons about dignity and self-respect, refused to accept that bargain. The old man had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting seemed impossible or futile. His grandfather had served in Vietnam, had come home to a country that didn't always appreciate his sacrifice, but had never let bitterness or compromise diminish his sense of what was right and wrong. "I need to get home," Marcus said firmly, attempting once again to walk his bike around the human obstacles blocking his path. "My mom is expecting me." This time Tyler didn't try to maintain even the pretense of politeness. He stepped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that the younger boy could smell the expensive cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. "You're not listening, Marcus. We're trying to help you here, but you keep being disrespectful. That's not how things work in this school." Jake moved to Marcus's left side while Devin remained near the bike, creating a triangle of intimidation that made escape increasingly difficult. The formation was clearly practiced, suggesting that this wasn't the first time these boys had used such tactics to get their way. Marcus found himself wondering how many other students had faced similar choices, and how many had simply given in rather than risk the consequences of resistance. "What exactly do you want from me?" Marcus asked, deciding that direct confrontation might be more effective than continued attempts at polite evasion. What do I have to do to make this stop? Tyler smiled, but the expression was cold and predatory. It's not about what you have to do, Marcus. It's about understanding your place. You're new here, which means you start at the bottom of the social ladder. You don't get to make demands or set conditions. You accept what we offer you, and maybe, if you prove yourself worthy, things will get better over time. The feudal language revealed the true nature of what Marcus was dealing with. These weren't just bullies looking for entertainment or easy targets. They were establishing and maintaining a power structure that gave them control over their environment. He represented a potential disruption to that system, someone who might inspire others to question the established order if he was allowed to exist independently. Devon decided to make their position even clearer. Here's how it works, new kid. You ride with us today, you let us check out your antique bike, and you show proper respect for the people who run this school. In exchange, we make sure nobody gives you any trouble, and maybe even help you meet some people. It's a good deal if you're smart enough to take it. Marcus looked around the parking lot one more time, hoping to see a teacher or administrator who might intervene if things escalated further. But the adult supervision that had been visible earlier in the day had largely disappeared, leaving the students to navigate these conflicts without official oversight. He was on his own, with only his own resources and judgment to rely on. "And if I say no?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Jake's grin was genuinely frightening in its anticipation of violence. "Then you find out what happens to people who don't cooperate. This is a small school, Marcus. We see you every day, in every class, at every event. There's nowhere to hide and no one who's going to protect you if we decide you're a problem." The threat was now completely explicit, leaving no room for misinterpretation or doubt. Marcus understood that he had reached a decision point that would define not just his immediate future, but his entire experience at this school. He could submit to their authority and accept whatever scraps of dignity they chose to leave him, or he could resist and face whatever consequences they had planned for students who refused to acknowledge their power. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his memory, words spoken during one of their many conversations in the garage workshop. "Marcus, there are times in life when you'll be faced with a choice between what's easy and what's right. Those moments define who you are as a person. The easy choice might seem appealing in the short term, but you'll have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life." The old man had been talking about a different situation entirely, a dispute with a neighbor over property lines that had tested his patience and principles. But the lesson applied perfectly to Marcus's current predicament. He could take the easy path and submit to Tyler's authority, but doing so would mean abandoning the values his grandfather had tried to instill in him. It would mean accepting that might makes right, that bullies deserved to win simply because they were willing to use force. "I'm going home," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that surprised even him. "If you want to stop me, you're going to have to do it physically. And if you do that, everyone in this parking lot is going to see exactly what kind of people you really are." Tyler's face flushed with anger at the direct challenge to his authority. For a moment, Marcus thought the older boy might actually resort to physical violence right there in front of dozens of witnesses. But Tyler had clearly learned enough about power dynamics to understand that public displays of aggression would undermine his carefully constructed image as a natural leader rather than a common thug. "This isn't over," Tyler said, his voice low and dangerous. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Marcus. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Devon reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Marcus to finally wheel his bike past the human barrier that had been blocking his escape. But as he moved, Devon's hand trailed along the vintage chrome, his fingertips leaving smudges on the carefully polished surface. It was a small violation, but one that felt deeply personal and intentional. "Nice bike," Devon said softly, his voice carrying implications that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Be a real shame if something happened to it." Marcus didn't respond to the threat, focusing instead on maintaining his composure as he walked his bicycle toward the parking lot exit. He could feel the eyes of Tyler and his friends boring into his back, could sense their frustrated anger at his refusal to submit to their authority. Every step felt dangerous, as though they might change their minds about public confrontation and attack him regardless of the witnesses. But he made it to the edge of the school property without further incident, finally mounting his bike and beginning the ride toward his new home. The familiar rhythm of pedaling helped calm his nerves, the smooth mechanical precision of his grandfather's restoration work providing a stark contrast to the ugly human dynamics he had just escaped. As he rode through the tree-lined streets of his new neighborhood, Marcus tried to process what had just happened and what it might mean for his future at Riverside Middle School. The encounter had revealed several troubling realities about his new environment. Tyler and his friends clearly wielded significant social power within the student body, enough to make credible threats about isolation and harassment. They had experience with intimidation tactics, suggesting that other students had faced similar choices and presumably made different decisions about resistance versus submission. Most concerning of all, they seemed to operate with relative impunity, confident that their actions wouldn't face serious consequences from school authorities. Marcus pedaled harder, pushing his grandfather's bike up a gentle hill that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. The autumn colors were spectacular, golden maples and crimson oaks, creating a tapestry of natural beauty that seemed to mock the ugliness of human cruelty he had just experienced. His grandfather would have loved this landscape, would have insisted. They stopped to appreciate the artistry of changing seasons and the patient work of time and weather in creating such magnificent displays. The thought of his grandfather brought both comfort and sadness. The old man had faced his own bullies in different contexts, had learned hard lessons about standing up for principles, even when doing so carried significant costs. His military service had taught him about courage under pressure, about the importance of doing what was right, even when frightened or uncertain. But he had also understood that sometimes wisdom required tactical retreats, strategic thinking, and careful preparation rather than immediate confrontation. Marcus reached his street just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains that ringed their small town. The house his mother had rented was modest but comfortable, a two-story colonial with a small front yard and a detached garage that would serve perfectly as a workshop space. She had chosen it partly because it reminded her of the home where Marcus had spent so many hours learning from his grandfather, and partly because the neighborhood seemed safe and family-friendly. As he wheeled his bike into the garage, Marcus made a mental inventory of the tools and equipment his grandfather had left him. The old man had been meticulous about maintaining his workshop, ensuring that every tool had its proper place and every project was documented with careful notes and diagrams. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal polish filled the space, bringing back memories of countless afternoons spent learning not just about bicycles, but about patience, precision, and the satisfaction that came from work done with care and attention to detail. Marcus carefully positioned his bike in the center of the garage, engaging the kickstand that his grandfather had specially modified to provide extra stability. Even in this simple action, he could feel the old man's influence, the way every component had been considered and improved upon until it functioned exactly as intended. The bike wasn't just transportation. It was a masterclass in mechanical engineering, a testament to the idea that anything worth doing was worth doing correctly. The threatening words of Tyler and his friends echoed in Marcus's mind as he began his evening routine of checking the bike's various systems. It was a ritual his grandfather had taught him, a way of ensuring that minor problems were caught before they became major failures. Each component received careful attention: the chain tension, the brake adjustment, the tire pressure, the bearing. play in the wheels. To an outside observer, it might have seemed obsessive, but Marcus understood it as a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the mechanical precision that his grandfather had valued above almost everything else. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the choice he had made in the school parking lot. Part of him wondered if he had been foolish to antagonize Tyler and his friends so directly. These boys clearly had the power to make his life miserable, and he would have to face them again tomorrow and every day after that for the remainder of his time at Riverside Middle School. Perhaps there might have been a way to handle the situation with more diplomacy, to find some middle ground that preserved his dignity while avoiding open conflict. But another part of him, the part that had internalized his grandfather's lessons about integrity and self-respect, knew that he had made the only choice he could live with. Submitting to their demands would have been the beginning of a slippery slope, each compromise making the next one easier until he had surrendered everything that made him who he was. His grandfather had often spoken about the importance of drawing lines that couldn't be crossed, about identifying the principles that were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted his thoughts, and Marcus looked up to see his mother's Honda Civic coming to a stop beside the garage. Dr. Sarah Chun had been working double shifts at the hospital since they moved to town, trying to establish herself in a new medical community, while also managing the stress of relocating their entire lives. The exhaustion was visible in her face as she climbed out of the car, but she still managed to smile when she saw Marcus working on his bike. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" she asked, approaching the garage with the careful steps of someone who had been on her feet for 12 hours straight. "Everything go okay at school?" Marcus considered how much to tell her about his encounter with Tyler and his friends. His mother had enough stress in her life without worrying about middle school politics and social hierarchies. She had made enormous sacrifices to move them to this town, accepting a position that paid less than her previous job, but offered better long-term opportunities and a chance for both of them to start fresh after the difficult year following his grandfather's death. "It was fine," Marcus said, continuing to adjust his bike's derailleur while they talked. "The teachers seem good and the classes don't look too difficult. Still getting used to everything, but I think it'll work out." Sarah studied her son's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading between the lines of adolescent communication. She had always been able to sense when he was holding something back, when the surface story didn't match the underlying emotional reality. But she also understood that sometimes teenagers needed space to process their experiences before they were ready to share them with adults. "That's good to hear," she said, settling onto an old wooden stool that had been part of his grandfather's workshop setup. "I know this transition hasn't been easy for you. Leaving all your friends behind, starting over in a new place. If you need to talk about anything, you know I'm always here, right?" Marcus nodded, touched by his mother's concern, but still not ready to burden her with his problems. "I know, Mom. Really, everything's fine. Just taking some time to figure out where I fit in." Sarah reached out to touch the handlebars of Marcus's bike, her fingers tracing the chrome surface that her father had polished to perfection. "He would be so proud of how you've taken care of this," she said softly. "You know, he spent months working on it, making sure every single component was exactly right. He used to tell me that this bike was going to be his legacy, the thing that would keep you connected to him even after he was gone." The mention of his grandfather brought a familiar mixture of sadness and determination to Marcus's chest. The old man had been the most important male figure in his life, especially after his father had walked away when Marcus was 7 years old. His grandfather had stepped into that void without hesitation, providing guidance, support, and unconditional love during some of the most formative years of Marcus's development. "I miss him," Marcus said simply, the words carrying weight that seemed disproportionate to their simplicity. "Sometimes I wish I could ask him what to do about things. He always seemed to know the right answer, even when the situation seemed impossible. Sarah smiled sadly, remembering her father's uncanny ability to cut through complexity and find the essential truth in any situation. He didn't always know the right answer, Marcus, but he had a way of thinking through problems that helped him make good decisions most of the time. He used to say that the key was to identify what really mattered and then have the courage to act on that understanding, even when it was difficult or unpopular. Marcus considered his mother's words as he finished his mechanical inspection and began putting his tools away in their designated locations. His grandfather's workshop had been a place of order and purpose, where every item had its proper place and every task was approached with methodical precision. The discipline required to maintain such organization had been one of the old man's most important lessons, though Marcus hadn't fully appreciated it at the time. "Mom," Marcus said carefully, testing the waters for a more direct conversation about his school situation. "What would you do if someone was trying to make you choose between standing up for yourself and avoiding trouble? Like, if doing the right thing was going to make your life harder?" Sarah recognized the hypothetical nature of the question, but understood that it probably reflected some real situation her son was grappling with. She had learned over the years that teenage boys often needed to approach difficult topics indirectly, working their way toward the heart of the matter through seemingly abstract discussions about principles and possibilities. "That's a tough question," she said thoughtfully. "I think it would depend on what kind of trouble we're talking about and what principles were at stake. Your grandfather used to say that some battles are worth fighting, even if you can't win them, because the act of fighting preserves something important about who you are as a person." Marcus nodded, finding comfort in the familiar wisdom even as he struggled with its practical application to his current circumstances. His grandfather had been an adult when he faced his most serious challenges, with resources and experience that Marcus didn't possess. The dynamics of middle school social hierarchies were different from the conflicts that adults typically navigated, with their own rules and consequences that didn't always align with broader principles of justice and fairness. But he also believed in being smart about how you fought, Sarah continued, sensing that her son needed more specific guidance. He used to tell stories about Vietnam, about times when direct confrontation would have been suicide, but strategic thinking and patience could achieve the same objectives with much less risk. Sometimes the right answer isn't to charge straight ahead, but to find a different approach that accomplishes your goals without unnecessary casualties. The military metaphors resonated with Marcus, who had grown up hearing his grandfather's war stories and absorbing their lessons about courage, strategy, and the importance of choosing your battles wisely. The old man had never glorified violence or conflict, but he had understood that sometimes fighting was necessary to preserve something more valuable than personal safety or comfort. As they talked, the evening light filtering through the garage windows began to fade, casting long shadows across the workshop space. Marcus found himself thinking about tomorrow, about the inevitable moment when he would have to face Tyler and his friends again. The confrontation in the parking lot had established the basic parameters of their conflict, but it hadn't resolved anything. If anything, it had probably made the situation more dangerous by publicly challenging Tyler's authority and forcing him to respond in order to maintain his reputation. "I should probably get started on homework," Marcus said, beginning to close up the garage for the evening. "Thanks for listening, Mom. It helps to talk through stuff, even when there aren't easy answers." Sarah stood up from her stool, stretching muscles that had been tensed for too many hours. "That's what I'm here for, sweetheart. And remember, if things at school get complicated, we can always talk to your teachers or the principal. Sometimes adult intervention is exactly what a situation needs, even when teenagers prefer to handle things themselves." Marcus nodded, though he suspected that involving adults would only make his problems worse. Middle school social dynamics operated according to their own logic, and official intervention often backfired by marking the victim as someone who couldn't handle their own problems. Tyler and his friends would be careful to avoid behavior that adults would recognize as bullying, while escalating their harassment in ways that were harder to document or prove. As his mother headed into the house to begin preparing dinner, Marcus took one last look at his grandfather's bike before turning off the garage lights. In the gathering darkness, the chrome fenders seemed to glow with their own internal light, reflecting the last rays of sunlight that slanted through the small windows. It was a beautiful machine, elegant in its simplicity and perfect in its execution. More than that, it represented a connection to someone who had believed in him unconditionally and taught him that some things were worth preserving regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices. Tyler and his friends would undoubtedly escalate their campaign to establish dominance and force Marcus into submission. The social dynamics of middle school would continue to operate according to their brutal logic, rewarding conformity and punishing independence. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of his grandfather's workshop, Marcus felt a sense of peace and determination that surprised him with its intensity. He had made his choice in the parking lot, had drawn a line that he wasn't willing to cross. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had remained true to the values his grandfather had tried to instill in him. The bike would be there in the morning, reliable and unchanged, ready to carry him through whatever trials awaited. And somewhere in the mechanical precision of its restored components, Marcus could feel the presence of the man who had taught him that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to remain yourself in the face of pressure to become something less. The second day began with an unsettling silence that followed Marcus through the school corridors like a shadow. Students who had offered polite greetings the day before now averted their eyes when he passed. Conversations died mid-sentence when he approached, and even teachers seemed less inclined to call on him during class discussions. The invisible web of social influence that Tyler commanded had clearly been activated overnight, transforming Marcus from a newcomer worthy of basic courtesy into someone marked for isolation. During morning break, Marcus discovered his locker had been vandalized with a crude drawing of a stick figure falling off what appeared to be an old-fashioned bicycle. The artwork was amateur, but the message was unmistakable. Someone had used a permanent marker to ensure the image would be difficult to remove, forcing Marcus to see it every time he accessed his books throughout the day. When he reported the incident to the hall monitor, Mrs. Rodriguez simply shrugged and suggested he speak to the janitor about cleaning supplies. The cafeteria presented its own challenges as Marcus found himself genuinely alone for the first time since starting school. The few students who had shown initial friendliness now seemed reluctant to make eye contact, their tables mysteriously full whenever he approached with his lunch tray. Tyler and his companions held court at their usual central location, their laughter carrying across the room with calculated loudness whenever Marcus passed within earshot. The isolation was methodical and complete, demonstrating just how thoroughly Tyler's influence penetrated the school's social ecosystem. Physical education class proved particularly difficult as Coach Rodriguez assigned partners for wrestling drills. Marcus found himself repeatedly paired with students who seemed either reluctant to engage or unusually aggressive in their techniques. Jake Morrison happened to be in the same class and took every opportunity to demonstrate submission holds with excessive force, always stopping just short of behavior that would attract official intervention. The coach, focused on instruction rather than subtle social dynamics, failed to notice the pattern of targeted harassment disguised as normal athletic activity. After school, Marcus approached his bike with heightened awareness, scanning the area for potential threats while trying to appear casual and unconcerned. The vintage Schwinn appeared untouched, but something felt different about the way it sat in the rack. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that someone had loosened his rear wheel just enough to make it wobble, dangerously, but not enough to be immediately obvious. The sabotage was sophisticated, suggesting mechanical knowledge beyond what most middle school students possessed. Marcus spent 20 minutes tightening the wheel and checking other components before feeling confident enough to ride home. The pattern of escalating harassment continued throughout the week as Tyler's campaign shifted from direct confrontation to psychological warfare. Marcus's textbooks disappeared from his locker, forcing him to share with reluctant classmates who made their displeasure obvious. His gym clothes were repeatedly soaked with water from the drinking fountain, creating the impression that he had poor hygiene habits. Someone began spreading rumors that his family was poor, that his mother couldn't afford proper school supplies, that his vintage bike was actually stolen property from a museum. Each incident was carefully calibrated to avoid crossing lines that would trigger administrative intervention, while maximizing the impact on Marcus's daily experience. Tyler had clearly learned from previous campaigns against other students, developing a systematic approach that isolated targets without creating evidence that adults would recognize as bullying. The sophistication of the harassment suggested this wasn't Tyler's first time orchestrating such a campaign, raising questions about how many other students had faced similar treatment. Marcus's academic performance began to suffer as the constant stress of vigilance took its toll on his concentration and energy. Teachers who had initially praised his thoughtful contributions to class discussions now found him distracted and unresponsive. His grades on pop quizzes and homework assignments started declining as he struggled to focus on schoolwork while constantly monitoring for the next attack. The cumulative effect was exactly what Tyler had intended, creating a downward spiral that would justify further social rejection. The harassment extended beyond school hours as anonymous phone calls began arriving at Marcus's home during dinner time. The callers would hang up immediately when his mother answered, but when Marcus picked up the phone, he would hear whispered threats about his bike, his safety, and his future at Riverside Middle School. The calls came from different numbers, suggesting coordination among Tyler's network of supporters. Marcus stopped answering the phone entirely, claiming he was too busy with homework whenever his mother asked him to pick up. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Marcus found himself lying awake at night, planning defensive strategies for scenarios that might never occur. He began timing his movements between classes to avoid predictable patterns, varying his routes through the school to make ambushes more difficult, and positioning himself near teachers whenever possible during unstructured time. The mental energy required to maintain constant defensive awareness was exhausting, leaving him drained and irritable even during supposedly safe periods at home. His mother noticed the changes but attributed them to normal adjustment difficulties associated with starting at a new school. When she asked about his social life, Marcus provided vague reassurances about meeting people and getting settled. He couldn't bring himself to admit that he was failing at the basic adolescent task of making friends, that he had somehow managed to make powerful enemies within days of arriving. The shame of social rejection felt worse than the harassment itself, particularly given his mother's sacrifices to provide him with a fresh start. The situation reached a new level of intensity when Marcus discovered that Tyler had created a group chat specifically dedicated to coordinating harassment activities. He learned about its existence when a student named Emma Walsh accidentally showed him a message thread while looking for something else on her phone. The glimpse he caught included detailed plans for tampering with his bike, scheduling conflicts to ensure his isolation, and assigning specific roles to different participants in the campaign against him. Emma immediately closed her phone and pretended the incident hadn't occurred, but the knowledge that his persecution was being planned and executed with such systematic precision filled Marcus with a cold dread that went beyond ordinary fear. This wasn't spontaneous bullying driven by momentary cruelty. It was an organized campaign designed to break his spirit and force his submission to Tyler's authority. The scale of coordination suggested that Tyler commanded loyalty from a significant portion of the student body, either through genuine admiration or through fear of becoming targets themselves. The psychological impact of discovering the group chat was devastating as Marcus realized that Students he had never even spoken to were actively participating in his persecution. Classmates who smiled politely during the day were apparently plotting against him during evening hours, sharing information about his routines and vulnerabilities like intelligence operatives coordinating a military campaign. The betrayal felt personal, even though these students owed him no loyalty, highlighting just how thoroughly Tyler had poisoned the social environment against him. Marcus began varying his route to school, sometimes walking instead of riding his bike to avoid predictable patterns that could be exploited for ambushes or sabotage. He started carrying his lunch instead of buying cafeteria food after discovering that someone had been putting salt in his chocolate, milk, and loosening the caps on his drink bottles. The constant vigilance required to protect himself from harassment was transforming him into exactly the paranoid, isolated figure that Tyler wanted him to become. The breaking point came during a fire drill when Marcus found himself separated from the main group of students evacuating his classroom. As he made his way toward the designated assembly area, he was surrounded by Tyler, Jake, Devin, and 2 other boys he didn't recognize. The group formed a loose circle around him in a section of the parking lot that was temporarily hidden from teacher supervision by a row of school buses. Tyler's demeanor was different this time, more focused and determined than during their previous encounters. The casual friendliness that had characterized his initial approach was completely gone, replaced by cold calculation that made Marcus understand this confrontation would be more serious than anything that had come before. The other boys seemed nervous but committed, suggesting they had been building up to this moment for days. The conversation was brief and explicitly threatening as Tyler informed Marcus that his continued resistance was unacceptable, and that more serious consequences would follow if he didn't immediately submit to their authority. Jake mentioned specific details about Marcus's daily routines, demonstrating how thoroughly they had been monitoring his movements. Devin made reference to his mother's work schedule at the hospital, implying that the harassment could extend to her professional life. If Marcus continued to resist, the threat against his mother crossed a line that Marcus hadn't known existed, transforming his fear into something approaching rage. The boys surrounding him seemed to sense the shift in his emotional state, their casual confidence wavering slightly as they recognized they might have pushed too far. Tyler quickly reasserted control over the situation, but not before Marcus had seen genuine uncertainty in the eyes of his tormentors for the first time since this campaign had begun. When teachers finally called for students to return to the building, the group dispersed quickly, leaving Marcus standing alone in the parking lot with the knowledge that his situation had fundamentally changed. The harassment was no longer just about middle school social dynamics. It had become something more dangerous and personal. Whatever happened next would determine not just his experience at Riverside Middle School, but potentially his family's entire future in their new community. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.